Oh, come in, dear. Don't you mind the chill in the air? It's just the old house breathing. Let me pour you a cup. There now. Earl Grey, with a little slice of lemon, just how I like it. The rain is making a lovely little tapping sound on the window pane, isn't it? Like a gentle drumbeat for the afternoon, you know. It's funny the things that send your mind tumbling back through the years. It's not always the big things, the birthdays or the holidays. Sometimes it's just a sound or a smell, or in my case today, this little thing right here. Do you see it? On the mantelpiece, just next to the old clock that's been ticking away longer than I have. This little wooden bird. It's a lark, see? The wings are carved so finely you'd think it could take flight right this second. It's smooth to the touch now, worn down by the worries of 1,000 different days. My father carved it for me. He had such clever hands, my papa. He could make a piece of driftwood look like it held all the secrets of the sea. He gave it to me the week before he went on his own journey. It was the autumn of 1958. The leaves on the great oak in our yard were turning the most brilliant shade of copper, like 1,000 new pennies scattered against the sky. I was 17, all elbows and knees, and a heart full of impossible dreams that felt too big for our tiny village. Papa was in his chair by the fire, his breathing shallow, a sound that had become the new, unwelcome rhythm of our home. He called me over, his voice thin as a whisper. "Eleanor," he said, pressing this little bird into my palm. His hand was so cold. "A lark," he told me. "They don't just sing, Nellie. They soar. They climb until you can't see them anymore, but you can still hear their song. Don't you ever let anyone stop your song." I didn't understand the weight of his words then. Not really. To me, it was just a pretty thing, a last gift. But after he was gone, the silence he left behind was deafening. The house felt smaller, the village more suffocating. My mother, bless her heart, she was wrapped in her grief like a thick, gray shawl. She saw safety in the familiar. She saw a future for me, married to the butcher's boy, living in the cottage down the lane, her daughter just a stone's throw away, and every time she mentioned it, I felt a cage closing around me. The butcher's boy was a nice enough lad, I suppose, smelled permanently of sawdust and bacon. But his dreams were small and practical, and mine were soaring, just like Papa's lark. I wanted to see a city, a proper one with buildings so tall they tickled the clouds. I wanted to hear an orchestra, to stand in a library so vast you could get lost in it for a week. These were not things you could find in our little corner of the world. The decision to leave was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It felt like a betrayal. I argued with my mother for weeks. They weren't loud, shouting arguments. Oh no, they were worse. They were quiet, tense battles fought over pots of tea and mending baskets. Her words were heavy with fear. "It's a wicked world out there, Eleanor. A girl alone. You've no idea." Maybe I didn't, but I knew, deep in my bones, that the world inside our cottage was slowly crushing me. I could feel my own song getting quieter and quieter, so, one Tuesday morning, before the sun had even thought about rising, I packed my things. It didn't take long. One brown suitcase, scuffed at the corners, holding 2 dresses, a spare cardigan, my father's copy of Jane Eyre, and the little wooden lock, which I wrapped in a wool sock for safekeeping. My mother stood at the door, her face pale in the pre-dawn gloom. She didn't cry. She just pressed a small, worn purse into my hand. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she whispered. Inside was 17 pounds, her entire savings. That single act of love and disapproval broke my heart more than any angry words could have. I walked the 2 miles to the train station. The world was still and silent, holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of my own shoes on the gravel and the frantic beating of my own heart. The station was deserted. Just me and a sleepy porter sweeping the platform. When the train finally came, hissing steam and groaning like some great iron beast, it felt like a monster and a savior. All at once, I found a seat by the window and I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just held my suitcase on my lap and stared straight ahead. As the train lurched forward, pulling me away from everything I had ever known, I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and closed my fingers around the wooden lark. It was small and solid and real. I wasn't just Eleanor anymore. I was a girl on a train with 17 pounds, a book of stories, and a silent promise to a ghost to keep on singing, even if I had no idea what the tune was supposed to be. The weight of that little bird in my pocket felt heavier than the whole world. Oh, the noise. I think that's what I remember most about arriving in London. The sheer, overwhelming roar of it all. The train had rumbled for hours, through green fields that slowly gave way to grimy rooftops and a sky choked with smoke. When I stepped out onto the platform at Paddington Station, it was like stepping into a different world entirely. The air was thick with the smell of coal, smoke and roasted peanuts, and something else, a kind of metallic, damp smell I'd never encountered before. It was the smell of thousands of people, all rushing somewhere, their faces set like stone, their shoulders hunched against the city and each other. The porters shouted, the whistles blew, and the announcements echoed from some unseen, godlike voice above. It was nothing like the gentle quiet of my village, where the loudest sound was the church bell on a Sunday. For a moment, a wave of pure terror washed over me. I just stood there, clutching the handle of my suitcase so tightly my knuckles were white, a little island of stillness in a great rushing river of people. I was 17 years old and I had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. My father had a cousin who lived somewhere in the city, but the address on the wrinkled piece of paper in my purse seemed like a code I couldn't crack. Ladbroke Grove. It sounded grand, but the reality of finding it was another matter. I must have looked like a lost lamb, because a kind-faced guard took pity on me. He pointed me towards the underground, the tube, he called it. He said it was the quickest way, quickest, maybe, but also the most frightening. It was like being swallowed by a metal worm, rattling and screeching through the dark belly of the earth. When I finally emerged, blinking, into the daylight of Ladbroke Grove, I felt dizzy and sick. The address led me not to a grand house, but to a tall, narrow building of grey brick, crammed between two others just like it. A small, hand-painted sign in the window read, "Rooms to let, no gentlemen callers, no cooking in rooms." I took a deep breath, straightened my cardigan, and knocked. The door was opened by a woman who seemed to be made entirely of sharp angles. She had a sharp nose, a sharp chin, and eyes that could have chipped stone. This was Mrs. Higgins, the landlady. She looked me up and down, her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. "Yes," she snapped, as if I'd interrupted something terribly important. I stammered that I was looking for a room. She gave a long, slow sigh, as if the effort of speaking to me was almost too much to bear. "Top floor, back, 5 shillings a week, paid on Friday, in advance. 1 bath a week, on a Sunday. You miss your slot, you wait till the next. Rules are on the back of the door. Break them, and you're out. You have a job." I lied. I said I did, that I was starting on Monday. I don't know why I said it, but I knew if I said no, that sharp door would be closed in my face. Her eyes narrowed, but she grunted and led me up 4 flights of creaking stairs. The air grew colder the higher we went. My room was little more than a cupboard. It had a narrow bed with a lumpy mattress, a small wardrobe, a rickety chair, and a tiny window that looked out onto a wall of blackened brick. There was a faint, lingering smell of boiled cabbage and damp, but it was a room. It was my room. I paid her the first week's rent, leaving me with £16 and 15 shillings, and the door clicked shut behind her. The sound of the lock turning echoing in the tiny space. That first night, I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and listened to the city. It never went quiet. There were always sirens, shouts, the distant rumble of a train. It was a monster that never slept. I took the little wooden lark out of my suitcase and set it on the windowsill. In the dim light from the street, it looked small and out of place, a creature of the open fields trapped in a cage of brick and smoke. I cried then, silent, hot tears for my father, for the familiar comfort of my own bed, even for my mother's worried face. What on earth had I done? The next morning, I woke with a new, grim determination. I had lied about having a job, so now I had to make it the truth. I spent the entire day walking, going from shop to shop, factory to factory. Every refusal was a small, chipping blow to my confidence. "No experience," they'd say. "We're not hiring girls," they'd say. By the end of the day, my feet were raw, and my stomach was a tight knot of hunger and fear. Finally, on the second day, I found the textile mill. It was a monstrous brick building that took up an entire block, its chimneys spewing thick gray smoke into the sky. The noise from inside was a physical thing. You could feel the vibration through the soles of your shoes from 100 yards away. They were hiring. The foreman, a man with a face like a bulldog, and hands stained with grease, barely looked at me. He just pointed to a door. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Don't be late. And that was it. I had a job. It wasn't in a grand library or an office. It was in the loudest, dirtiest place I had ever seen. But it was a start. As I walked back to my little room, the roar of the city seemed a little less frightening. It was still a monster. Oh yes. But now, I had found my own small place within its belly. I had a foothold, however precarious. And for the first time since leaving home, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope began to push back against the fear. I was a working girl now. The inside of the mill was like a vision of hell. The noise was a physical assault, a constant, deafening clatter and roar from 100 weaving looms that shook the very floor beneath my feet. Within an hour, my head was pounding. The air was thick with cotton dust that clogged your throat and made your eyes water. Women, their hair tied up in scarves, moved like ghosts through the aisles, their faces grim with concentration, their hands a blur of motion as they tended the great, rattling machines. My job was to be a duffer. It meant that when the bobbins on the spinning frames were full, I had to quickly remove them and replace them with empty ones. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The machines never stopped. You had to dart in, your fingers nimble, and swap them over in a matter of seconds. My hands, which were used to gardening and needlework, were clumsy and slow. In the first hour, I was shouted at by the foreman 3 times. My fingers were soon raw and bleeding from the coarse thread. An older woman working on the next machine oversaw my struggle. During the brief mid-morning break, when the looms were silenced for 10 precious minutes, she came over. "You'll get the knack of it, love," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the noise for years. "I'm Betty." She had a kind, tired face, etched with a web of fine lines. She showed me how to hold my hands, how to use the heel of my palm, to knock the full bobbins free in one swift movement. She didn't have to be kind to the new girl, but she was. In that terrifying alien world, Betty's small kindness felt like a lifeline. The days settled into a grueling rhythm. Wake in the dark, cold room. Walk the 20 minutes to the mill. 10 hours of deafening noise and frantic work. Walk home, my body aching with a weariness I'd never known. Eat a sad little meal of bread and cheese in my room. Mrs. Higgins's no cooking rule was absolute. Fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep, and then do it all over again. My life shrank to this single, repeating pattern. The dreams of libraries and orchestras seemed like fantasies from another life. This was reality. The roar of the looms, the ache in my back, the 5 shillings for Mrs. Higgins every Friday. I wrote to my mother every week. Careful, cheerful letters that painted a very different picture. I told her about the parks, the museums I planned to visit, the interesting people I was meeting. I never mentioned the bleeding fingers, the loneliness that was a constant ache in my chest, or the cabbage smell in the hallway. I didn't want her to worry, but mostly, I didn't want her to be right. My pride was a fierce, stubborn thing, by the way, dear. Writing those letters always makes me wonder about you. Where are you watching this from? What time is it there in your part of the world? It's a marvel, isn't it, that we can share these moments across all that distance? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, to know a little bit about the person sharing this cup of tea with me. Well, back to the mill. Weeks turned into months. I got better at my job. My hands toughened up, and the noise became a dull roar I could almost ignore. Betty and I became friends. We'd share our lunch, a sandwich, and an apple, sitting on a crate in the yard, our backs to the grimy brick wall. She told me about her husband, who'd been lost in the war, and her son, who was away at sea. I told her about my father and his carvings, and the little village that felt a million miles away. It was during one of these lunch breaks that I first properly met Arthur. I had seen him before, of course. He worked in the offices upstairs, a place the factory floor girls spoke of in hushed tones. He wore a crisp shirt and a tie, and he never had grease on his hands. He would sometimes walk through the factory floor with the owner, his head held high, looking straight ahead. He seemed to belong to a different species. One day, I was sitting alone. Betty was home with a cough, reading my worn copy of Jane Eyre for the 10th time. I was so lost in the world of Thornfield Hall that I didn't see him approach. "That's a good one," a quiet voice said. I looked up, startled. It was him, Arthur. He had kind eyes, a gentle brown, and a smile that seemed a little shy. I felt my face flush. "We weren't supposed to fraternize with the office staff." "Oh, yes, it's my favorite." My mother loves the Bronte sisters, he said, lingering for a moment. Hard to find a quiet corner to read in here, I imagine. You get used to it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, gave another small smile, and then he was gone. It was nothing, a 30-second conversation. But for the rest of the day, I felt a strange, unfamiliar flutter in my chest. In the gray, grinding world of the mill, that tiny interaction was a splash of impossible color. I found myself looking for him, catching glimpses of him through the grimy office windows. It was foolish, I knew. He was from a different world. But it was a secret, a little warmth that I could carry with me through the long, loud hours. A melody only I could hear, beneath the relentless rhythm of the machines. Our little conversations became a secret ritual. Arthur would find a reason to walk through the mill around lunchtime, and if I was alone, he'd stop for a minute or two. He learned my name was Eleanor, though he liked to call me Nellie. He asked me about the book I was reading, and when I finished it, he brought me another. It was a book of poetry, Keats, wrapped in brown paper so no one would see. I hid it under my mattress like it was treasure. Reading those poems in my tiny cold room at night was like opening a window in a prison. His small acts of kindness were the only beautiful things in my life. We never talked for long, always aware of the foreman's watchful eyes, but in those stolen moments, we built a fragile bridge between our two worlds. He told me he was studying to be an architect at night school. He dreamed of designing beautiful buildings, full of light and air, so different from the grim factory where we worked. I told him about my father, about his belief that everyone had a song they were meant to sing. I think I've forgotten my song, I admitted to him one day, my voice low. I don't think so, he said, his gaze serious. I think you just can't hear it over all this noise. His words stayed with me. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was still there, just waiting for a bit of silence. Of course, our friendship, if you could call it that, did not go unnoticed. You, be careful, love, Betty warned me one afternoon, her voice gentle but firm. Them office boys, they're not for us. It's a game to them. Don't you go getting your heart tangled up in something that can only lead to trouble. And then there was Mrs. Higgins. She saw Arthur walk me to the end of the street one evening. He had waited for me after my shift, wanting to give me another book. It was the most daring thing we'd done. Mrs. Higgins was waiting for me in the hallway when I got in, her arms crossed, her face a thunderclap. I run a respectable house, Missy, she hissed, her voice low and sharp. I will not have you entertaining gentlemen. You're a factory girl. You'd do well to remember your place and not get ideas above your station. Her words stung, mostly because they echoed the fears in my own heart. I knew she was right. What could a boy like Arthur, whose father was a partner in the firm that owned the mill, ever truly see in a girl like me? I was a novelty, a story he might one day tell his friends. I tried to pull away. I'd be busy when he came by at lunch, or I'd avoid his eyes. The world felt safer when it was just gray, without the painful splash of color he brought to it. But Arthur was persistent. He left a note in the next book, a simple, "Are you all right, Nellie?" And I knew I couldn't keep lying to myself. I enjoyed talking to him. He was the only person who saw me as more than just a pair of hands to run a machine. Our worlds collided properly one dreadful Tuesday. One of the big looms, a notoriously troublesome machine that the foreman, Mr. Finch, had ignored. Complaints about 4 weeks, finally gave out. A shuttle broke free, flying across the aisle like a wooden bullet. It struck Betty's machine, causing a catastrophic jam. In the chaos, Betty's hand was caught. Her scream was thin and high, barely audible over the din before the machines ground to a halt. It was awful. She was lucky not to have lost her hand entirely, but it was badly broken. The factory owner, Mr. Albright, a stern, imposing man, came down from the offices. Arthur was with him, his face pale with shock. Mr. Finch, the foreman, was quick to deflect blame. "It was her fault, sir," he said, pointing a greasy finger towards where Betty was being tended to. "Operator error. She was being careless. The old fool." My blood went cold. It was a blatant lie. We had all seen it. We all knew that machine was a death trap waiting to happen. I looked around at the faces of the other women. They stared at the floor, at the silent looms, anywhere but at Mr. Albright. They had families to feed. They couldn't afford to speak up. Fear was a thick, choking blanket in that room. Mr. Albright turned to go, satisfied with the explanation. And in that moment, I felt my father's words echo in my mind. Don't you ever let anyone stop your song. My song wasn't about music or poetry. It was about truth. It was about standing up for a kind woman who was being wronged. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Arthur, and his eyes met mine. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the courage I needed. That's not true, I said. My voice was small, but in the sudden silence of the mill, it sounded like a shout. Every head in that vast, silent room turned towards me. Mr. Finch, the foreman, swiveled around, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Mr. Albright, the owner, paused with his hand on the office door and looked back at me, his expression one of pure annoyance. It was like a scene from a play. And I was the foolish character who had just forgotten all her lines and said something terribly, terribly wrong. My legs felt like they might give way beneath me. What did you say, girl? Mr. Finch barked, taking a step towards me. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry as dust. I could feel Arthur's gaze on me, steady and encouraging. I thought of Betty, her face creased in pain, being helped away, and I thought of the little wooden lark in my room. A lark doesn't ask for permission to sing. It just does. I said. That's not true, I repeated, my voice a little stronger this time. It wasn't Betty's fault. That loom has been faulty for months. We've all reported it to Mr. Finch several times. He's done nothing about it. A collective gasp went through the room. You could have heard a pin drop. To question a foreman, in front of the owner, was unthinkable. It was suicide. Mr. Finch looked as if he might actually explode. That's a lie. This girl is a troublemaker, sir. Always has been. Mr. Albright walked slowly back towards me, his shoes clicking ominously on the concrete floor. He was a tall man, and he looked down at me from a great height. And who are you? Eleanor Vance, sir. And you're an expert on textile machinery, are you, Miss Vance? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. No, sir, I said, my chin held high even though I was trembling inside. I'm an expert on what I see every day. I work here. We all knew that machine was dangerous. Betty is the most careful worker in this mill. It wasn't her fault. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. I looked past him, to the other women. I pleaded with them with my eyes. Say something. Back me up. But they remained silent, their faces frozen with fear. They couldn't risk it. I was alone. Mr. Albright's lips thinned into a grim line. He valued order and productivity above all else. An injured worker was an inconvenience. A talking worker was a threat. He turned to the foreman. Finch, pay this girl her week's wages. She's finished. I want her out of my factory immediately. And just like that, it was over. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. She's finished. I had stood up for what was right, and it had cost me everything. The other women wouldn't look at me. I was a pariah, a cautionary tale. Mr. Finch practically threw my wages at me and pointed towards the door. Get out. I walked the length of that factory floor, past the silent women and the dead machines, my head held high. But it was the hardest walk of my life. When I passed Arthur, he whispered, I'm so sorry, Nellie, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. His words were a small comfort, but they couldn't stop the tide of panic rising in my chest. I collected my things from the small locker, my hands shaking so much I could barely unbutton my coat. Outside, the city air felt cold and hostile. I had no job. I had a week's rent in my pocket, and that was it. My lie to Mrs. Higgins had finally caught up with me. That evening, Arthur came to my boarding house. It was a huge risk for him. He stood in the dreary hallway, looking terribly out of place. My father is furious, he said, his voice low. Not at you. At the situation. He knows you were telling the truth. Finch has been let go. So I was right, I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. And I still lost my job. It's not fair, he said, his own face a mask of frustration. Look, Nellie, I want to help. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some folded banknotes. Please, take this. It will help you get by until you find something else. I looked at the money in his hand, and then at his earnest, worried face. He meant to be kind, I knew that, but my pride, that stubborn, foolish pride that had gotten me into this mess, reared its head. I had come to this city to stand on my own 2 feet, not to be saved by a wealthy boy who felt sorry for me. Taking his money would make me everything Mrs. Higgins accused me of being. I can't, I said, shaking my head. Thank you, Arthur, but I can't. He didn't understand. We argued, there in that dim hallway. It wasn't an angry argument, but it was full of the painful, unbridgeable gap between our lives. "Why are you being so stubborn?" he asked, exasperated. "Because this is all I have left," I told him, my voice cracking. "If I take your money, what am I? I have to do this myself." He eventually left, the money still in his pocket, a look of hurt and confusion on his face. I knew in that moment that something had broken between us. The fragile bridge we had built couldn't withstand the weight of reality. I went up to my room, sat on my bed, and for the first time, I felt truly defeated. The city had won. It had chewed me up and spit me out. My mother's warnings, Mrs. Higgins's sneers, they all came rushing back. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here. Maybe it was time to take my wooden lark and go home. The next few days were the longest of my life. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece in the downstairs hall seemed to get louder, counting down the minutes until Friday, when my rent was due and I would have to face Mrs. Higgins with empty pockets. The city that had once seemed full of possibilities now felt like a labyrinth of closed doors. I walked 4 miles, my shoes thin and worn, but the answer was always the same. "We're not looking for anyone." My brief, infamous career as a troublemaker at the mill seemed to follow me. Word travels fast in those communities. Each night, I returned to my little room feeling smaller and more hopeless. The shame was a physical weight. I'd sit on my bed and hold the wooden lark, its smooth surface, a small comfort in the dark. I remembered my father's hands carving it, the smell of the wood shavings. They climb until you can't see them, but you can still hear their song. My song felt very, very quiet. I had a train timetable tucked inside my copy of Jane Eyre. I looked at it more and more, imagining the journey back, the taste of failure bitter in my mouth. On Thursday morning, the day before my time was up, there was a knock on my door. I expected it to be Mrs. Higgins with a premature eviction notice, but when I opened it, she was standing there holding a small, steaming meat pie on a plate. It was so out of character that for a moment, I could only stare. "Thought you might be hungry," she mumbled, not quite meeting my eye. "Heard what happened at the mill?" She thrust the plate at me. "I don't hold with troublemakers, but I don't hold with bullies like Finch, neither. My husband worked the docks. I know the type." I was speechless. This woman, who had been a constant sharp-edged presence in my life, was showing me kindness. It was a gruff, reluctant kindness, but it was there. "There's a bakery down on Portobello Road," she said, her tone all business again. "Old man Hemlock's place. His wife passed last year, and he's struggling to keep up. He's a grump, but he's a fair one. Might be looking for a lass to help with the counter. Can't pay much mind." And with that, she turned and marched back down the stairs, leaving me with the warm pie and a sliver of hope. I ate the pie. It was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted and went straight to the bakery. It was a tiny shop, squeezed between a butcher's and a bookbinder, with a cheerful red-striped awning. The moment I opened the door, the most wonderful smell enveloped me. It was the smell of yeast and sugar, of warm bread and cinnamon, a smell of comfort and home. Mr. Hemlock was exactly as Mrs. Higgins had described him, an elderly man, dusted in a fine layer of flour, with a face that looked like it had been permanently set in a scowl. "What do you want?" he grumbled, kneading a great mound of dough with surprising strength. I told him Mrs. Higgins had sent me, that I was looking for work. I told him I was a hard worker and a fast learner. I didn't tell him I'd been fired from my last job. I just said I was looking for a change. He grunted and looked at my hands. They were no longer the soft hands of a village girl. They were calloused and capable from my time at the mill. "Can you start now?" he asked. And so, my life changed again. I went from the deafening roar of the looms to the quiet, rhythmic thump of dough being worked on a wooden board. I went from the smell of machine oil and cotton dust to the life-affirming scent of baking bread. My job was to serve the customers, to wrap the warm loaves in paper, to keep the little shop tidy. It was simple, honest work. The pay was, as Mrs. Higgins had predicted, far less than I'd earned at the mill. I could no longer afford my room at the boarding house, but Mr. Hemlock, after a week of watching me work, made me an offer. There was a tiny room above the shop, barely bigger than the one I had, which had been used for storage. I could live there for a pittance, deducted from my wages. I said goodbye to Mrs. Higgins, who saw me off with a curt nod that almost looked like a smile. I saw Arthur one last time. He waited for me outside the bakery. He told me he was leaving for a new job his father had arranged in another city. It was for the best. We both knew our lives were on different paths. We wished each other well, a sad, sweet ending to a chapter that had never really had a proper beginning. It hurt, but it was a clean break, a necessary one. Living above the bakery was like living in a different London. I woke up not to an alarm clock, but to the smell of the first batch of bread being pulled from the ovens. Mr. Hemlock was a man of few words, but he was kind in his own way. He taught me how to tell when the bread was perfectly proofed, how to glaze the buns so they shone like jewels. He never smiled, but sometimes, when a customer complimented the day's baking, I would see a flicker of pride in his old eyes. My life became small and quiet, but it was my own. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. In the evenings, I would sit in my little room, the comforting smells of the bakery wafting up through the floorboards, and I would read the books Arthur had given me. I felt the ache of his absence, the phantom limb of a future that wasn't to be, but it was mingled with a new sense of peace. I had faced the monster, and I had found my own safe corner, not by running, but by standing my ground and then, by a stroke of luck, finding a different path. I still had the wooden lark. I put it on my new windowsill, overlooking the bustling market street. It didn't look so out of place anymore. It looked like it was home. Years have a way of slipping by like water through your fingers, don't they? The seasons turned over Portobello Road. The fashions changed. The music on the radios changed. But the rhythm of the bakery stayed wonderfully the same. The thump of the dough, the bell over the door, the smell of hot bread on a cold morning. Mr. Hemlock grew older and slower, his scowl softening into something more like gentle concentration, and I grew up. I learned the secrets of the trade not through lessons, but through watching and doing. I learned the soul of the sourdough starter, which Mr. Hemlock had kept alive for over 40 years. I learned the precise amount of cinnamon for the Saturday morning buns that had people queuing down the street. The bakery wasn't just my job. It became my life's work. It was a quiet life, a world away from the grand dreams I once had of orchestras and vast libraries. But it was a good life. It was real. When Mr. Hemlock finally decided to retire, his hands too stiff with arthritis to knead the dough anymore, I was terrified he would sell the shop. I had saved what I could over the years, but it wasn't much. He called me into the back room, the place where we drank our morning tea. He looked at me with his grumpy kind eyes and said, "It's yours, lass, if you'll have it." He had arranged it so I could buy it from him, paying him a little each month out of the profits. He said he couldn't bear to see it fall into the hands of someone who didn't understand the dough. It was the greatest compliment he had ever given me. My mother came to visit, finally. It took her 10 years to build up the courage to get on that train. She stepped into the bakery, looking around at my little kingdom of flour and sugar, and I saw the fear in her eyes finally melt away, replaced by a look of bewildered pride. She stayed for a week, sleeping in my little room above the shop. She saw the way the customers greeted me by name, the way I ran the place with a quiet confidence she'd never seen in her daughter before. One morning, as we were sharing a cup of tea before the shop opened, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Your father would have been so proud of you, Eleanor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, all the old hurt and misunderstanding between us washed away. We were just a mother and a daughter, finally seeing each other for who we truly were. I never married. There were kind men, yes, a few sparks here and there, but my heart belonged to the bakery. It was a demanding partner, and a fulfilling one. My customers became my family. I saw their children grow up, celebrated their weddings with cakes I'd baked myself, and provided loaves for their family tables. My life was woven into the fabric of the community, a steady, comforting presence, and so, here I am, an old woman now, with hands that are gnarled and flour-dusted for good. I sold the bakery a few years ago to a lovely young couple who understood the dough, and I moved here, to this quiet little house with a garden, where the loudest sound is the ticking of the clock and the kettle whistling for tea. I look at this little wooden lark now, the one that started it all. For so many years, I thought Papa's words about singing my song meant I had to do something grand, something loud and important that the whole world would notice. I thought it meant being the heroine of a dramatic story, like the ones in my books. For a long time, I thought I had failed him, that I had ended up with a small life instead of a big one. But I was wrong. You see, it took me a lifetime to understand. Courage isn't always a roar. Sometimes, it is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. Integrity isn't always a grand gesture in front of a crowd. Sometimes, it's simply refusing to be anything other than who you are, even when it's hard. And a song. Well, a song doesn't have to be heard by millions to be beautiful. It can be the quiet, steady rhythm of a life well lived. It can be the thump of dough on a wooden board, the jingle of a bell on a shop door, the sharing of a warm loaf of bread. That day at the train station, holding this little bird, I thought my life was about to begin. And it was, but it wasn't the life I imagined. It was something far more ordinary and far more profound. I didn't get the love story from the books or the glamorous city job. I got something better. I got myself. I learned to be strong, not in spite of my hardships, but because of them. I found a different kind of song to sing, one that was baked in warmth and kindness and the quiet dignity of a day's honest work. And it has been a beautiful song, my dear, a very beautiful song, indeed. Now, how about another cup of tea?